Good morning. This is the 92nd day of Ukrainian resistance. This is Media Center Ukraine. We start this morning with talking to the chairperson of the board of the Pension Fund of Ukraine, Yevhenii Kapinus. Good morning. Good morning. So our question to you is straightforward and difficult. Tell us about the pension fund status currently. A wonderful question to start with. Unfortunately, I have to report that the situation overall with the pension fund, as in the country in general, is challenging. However, we are in a good condition. Still, we are actively providing the services that are the mandate of the pension fund. We are paying out the pension allowances according to the Ukrainian legislation. Moreover, to discuss the first months of war, we paid out the allowances ahead of the schedule, and I think it is a very good dynamics. Tell us about the deficit or the profit of the pension fund and the trends you've been seeing recently. Well, let me start addressing your question with saying how grateful we are to the Ukrainian businesses who, despite the dire situation, despite the circumstances that we have found ourselves in, the businesses are paying their due. And if we consider the revenues paid in from the beginning of the year, we received 10 billion revenue in excess of the last year's performance. These last few months, the situation has deteriorated, and in April, we have received the same level of revenues as last year. We predicted somewhat better for performance before the war, but still, it is a major victory. It is indicative that although we are under extremely difficult circumstances, the business is honoring its commitment, say as the government is honoring its commitment. We're paying out the allowances in full, and that is enabling us to ensure funding to pay out the pension fund liabilities, making sure the retired people receive their pension allowances on time and as scheduled. In March, we conducted the indexation of the accounts planned for the time, and people are receiving the pension allowances as they were planned before the war, but also with all the indices that were enshrined in the Ukrainian legislation. How optimistic can we be that this trend is going to stay when the government is able to deliver on its commitments? What are your prospects? Perhaps considering that in the most challenging times, in the beginning of the fallout war, we were able to pay our commitments ahead of schedule and in full volume. I'd say this is a good prerequisite to say that the same is going to stay true in the future. As of today, I cannot envisage any hindrances that would sway this situation. Paying pensions to the internally displaced people. How have you been able to do it? What will you be doing? What do the IDPs need to know? That is one of the challenges we're tackling these days. We've seen that in the first months of war, there will be significant displacement of the Ukrainian people, and people will head towards safer area. So a number of approaches were designed in order to address the situation so that the person, no matter where they are located, would be able to receive their pension allowances. Let me break that question down into two. Firstly, there are IDPs receiving their pensions to their bank accounts, and those who have done so earlier were able to withdraw the money wherever they were, having no difficulties. The transfers to the bank accounts were made uh, on a regular basis, and people had unlimited access to their money from wherever they were. The second category of people, the people who received their pensions at the postal offices, and they had to stay home in order for the pension to be delivered to their home. Considering the displacement, we came out with an approach when a person could go to any postal outlet of the pension fund or Ukrainian postal company, wherever they were in Ukraine, and still be able to receive the pension, having reported their location and say that they would like their pension to be paid there. So this is a two-pronged approach. People could either get their pensions in a postal office or uh, have a transfer of the money in the savings account, a savings bank account, and get their pension there. So we try to accommodate the different circumstances so that no matter where people ended up with, they would be able to get their pension allowance without any hindrance, without any delay. Do you have any verified information about the numbers of IDPs who received the pension allowances to their bank accounts or the pensions paid out in cash? Well, we received 5,000 requests of people who were displaced, who wanted to receive their pension allowances there. But most people went to the postal office outlets and they uh, transferred the money internally so they would have the exact numbers. We handled 5,000 requests from such people. Thank you. Paying the pensions to the people in the deoccupied territories. Are you resuming the payouts? Can you give us some more insights about that? Thank you for your question. Let me say that we try to make every effort so that the people could be in a position to have access to the full range of services delivered by the pension fund in the deoccupied territories. We reopened our branches in Kyiv region, in Irpin, Bucha, Borodyanka. Currently, we are working to open our outlets in Kharkiv region so that people would have access to the key services of the pension fund. Moreover, in the regions when people face difficulties, we try to make the information available about the phone numbers people can call to access the pension fund services. As for the deoccupied territories, the payments that are made to the bank accounts are transferred automatically and in full. And as to the postal payments, the postal service is sparing no effort to deliver the full range of services, and this is confirmed as in the deoccupied services, postal service was amongst the first to reopen its operation in order to offer payments to the people. It's Kharkiv region and Kyiv region, as well as Sumy regions. They have ramped up their mobile operation and stationary operations most efficiently in order to expedite the payments on the territory. I have an even more challenging question for you. What happens to the pensioners in the occupied territories, in the cities like Kherson, Melitopol, Berdyansk, what is the situation like on the ground there? This is one of the most difficult questions currently. The question of paying out the allowances. The retired people who use their bank accounts have their pensions accrued to their accounts, and they can use their card to make payments or to withdraw cash from the banks that are still operating. A number of banks have continued their banking operations. They experienced some shortages because they could not replenish their cash vaults, but nevertheless, the banking system performed the best it could in the regions. As for the postal payments, we have to say that currently the postal service too spared no effort to make the payments according to the plan, and now the postal stations are making payments in Zaporizhzhia, where the hostilities are raging, in Donetsk as well as Luhansk region, and this shows that despite the challenges, we persevere and deliver on the commitments we have undertaken to provide payments to the people. Naturally, there are difficulties in the regions where active hostilities are developing. No, not all places are accessible. Not all payments can be expedited accordingly. If that is the case, the way out is for the person to relocate to a safer place and be able to receive the payments once they've relocated. If the people cannot relocate, then we guarantee that the payments will either be accrued on the bank accounts as the money belongs to the person once it's been transferred to their account, or if it's a case of person receiving the payments through the post, they will receive their entitlement after the deoccupation. Thank you very much for your insights. We talked to Yevhenii Kapinus, the chairperson of the board of the Pension Fund of Ukraine. Our next briefing is at 11. We will talk to Oleksii Honcharenko, an MP who is currently attending the Davos World Economic Forum. See you. Good day. This is the 92nd day of the Ukrainian resistance and the operation of the media center Ukraine. Today we'll talk about Davos. We'll discuss Davos with Oleksii Honcharenko, an MP of Ukraine. Good day. Greetings. Oleksii, we have a straightforward question to you. What struck you or what do you remember most from this Davos event? This was a truly Ukrainian Davos, and Ukraine was on top of the agenda, topic number one, everywhere. Let me remind you that Davos is a World Economic Forum, first and foremost, but Ukraine was truly on top of the agenda across all panels, and this is what struck me, and certainly it is critically important for us. Some people are saying there's a certain fatigue of Ukraine, some certain fatigue of Ukraine war, but Davos has proven the contrary. For certain, we are and shall remain topic number one. Other countries, like Pakistan and some other countries, have issued opinions like, will we talk anything except Ukraine with due respect? So people have been jealous in a way, but still we've remained the top topic at Davos World Economic Forum. We understand that we've been on top of the agenda, but can you give us, some specific, some takeaways of this Davos Forum? Well, firstly, Davos isn't a place where decisions are made on a formal level. This is a place where some contracts are signed, but rarely. This is a trend-setting platform. This is where agreements are reached. And for certain, we can make the conclusion that the Western world will stand with Ukraine uh, financially, and that is so important for us, considering that the national economy of Ukraine has come to a stall. The war is going into a protracted phase, and this is understood. Nobody is looking forward to a speedy resolution. And the West is prepared to keep standing with Ukraine in this war. The next question we should address is what is the desirable end state. It may be one for us, it may be seen differently for them, but we've got to iron it out. There are many outstanding questions, and it is for Ukraine to answer the questions. And that is important. We are now past the sprint, and we are now having won the sprint, having battled Kiev, we're now going into the marathon, having sustained heavy losses, having the massive war in Donbass. So we are now into a marathon phase, and the matter of international support equals the importance of military support. So these are the key questions. We'd be hard pressed without the international support, and we need to fight to secure the support. We need to keep arguing and describe what's happening in the battlefront, what's happening in the Black Sea, what's happening with the negotiations. But still, no matter how well publicized these developments are, we still have to do a lot of explaining. This is the first ever Davos without Russia taking part. What is said about the future of Russia? Where will it belong in the world system of coordinates? Will it be isolated? Will there be collective pressure exercised on Russia from the collective West? What's in the air? Indeed, this is the first ever Davos without Russia. It's very symbolic and indicative that the Russian House was turned into the Russian atrocity crimes house. This used to be the venue where people were treated with black caviar, different oil, gas, and pump lines were discussed. But now this Russian atrocity crimes House sends a very potent signal. There's an exhibition of the very best Ukrainian photographer, including the deceased Max Levin, and it's truly heart-rendering and striking, and it's very symbolic that it is housed in the very same house. As for the messengers on Russia and the plans and expectations, well, they'd be different depending on people, but Russia has chosen to leave the global civilized society. Some admitted it openly. Some it had to admit it, having sustained economic loss. Some still hope to recover the losses, but there are a few voices denying the fact. So it's a common admission. I had talked to a number of people who apologized to me for failing to understand, for denying us their support, for not seeing the threat emanating from Russia. And that is indicative. As for the future that lies for Russia, it's hard to say for anyone. Apparently, this is going to be one of the major challenges for the world. People are aware of that and are prepared to work to stop the threat and meet the challenge. Thank you for this answer. Tell us, what should Ukraine be doing in order to win? What does Ukraine need to do with its foreign partners and friends in order to win? What are your takeaways from Davos? Let me discuss the topics that I initiated, and they led the discussion. Firstly, it's a issue of atrocity crimes and tribunals of Russian war criminals and Russian military and political leadership topped by Putin. This is a very important matter. It is a key interest for ourselves in order to ensure accountability, bringing justice, preventing the repetition of the same crimes in the future. And now the Russians need to know that they will be held accountable. And if we raise the topic, that will help prevent the crimes and protect 100,000 Ukrainians who are now in isolation. Another issue is further isolation of Russia. The question has been raised. It has received a lot of attention and should continue receiving attention. The next question is support to Ukraine. We have discussed military support to Ukraine, although Davos isn't exactly the value, but we did discuss military support, and that has received a lot of attention. But economic assistance is another issue that has received attention. The economic and financial support to Ukraine were discussed. Sanctions were discussed, and one should be done about oil and gas, and that fits into Davos perfectly. There are countries that be willing to be doing business almost as usual, but still be doing business. We need to continue levying pressure and raising this question at all platforms. The next important matter is the recovery of Ukraine. Having talked to some speakers, I advocated that we need to start rebuilding Ukraine now, not even waiting for the hostilities to cease. That is more complicated, and that raises the question of missile strikes, etc. But we have to argue that this sends an important signal. Secondly, it's a way to boost the economy, and it's also a way to address the refugees, as many people are returning home to Ukraine already, and many people don't have a house, a home to go back to. And building homes in the quieter regions of Ukraine for the people who can't go home yet, or whose homes have been occupied or reduced to rubble, would send a very powerful signal and would be very important for us and for those people. So these are some of the topics that led the agenda, that we brought into the discussion. And certainly, Davos is a platform which is covered by the leading mass media. And I had a chance to talk to the editor-in-chief of the Wall Street Journal, The Economist, the leading journalists of the Financial Times, CNBC, and other mass media outlets. So these are the leading global and financial publications of the world. And that is a very important instrument that we should use. We talked about the editorial in the New York Times that has caused a lot of uproar in Ukraine and worldwide, saying that Ukraine has to make concessions of some kind. And this idea of saving face for Putin and the concessions that Ukraine is ready to make, this narrative is being developed, and we need to counter it. They all say that it is for Ukraine to decide, but they are trying to gauge some cautious advice. But we have to make it clear that we are not going to concede our territories, we are not going to concede our sovereignty, and most importantly, we are not going to concede our people, as they're in the occupation now. And we need to argue that the best way to bring this war to a close, and that is what everyone wants to see happen, would be to help Ukraine win this war as soon as possible. We need to explain and argue and promote this idea. George Soros said that he perceives three scenarios: a crisis, the world global war, and total annihilation of the civilization. This is according to George Soros. The world is preparing for a crisis. It has already started, and the war is an economic crisis triggering a social crisis. The global energy prices, the sanctions are hitting Russia, and they have further ramifications. The world food prices, the blockage of the Black Sea was amongst the most popularly discussed topics. Odessa port was mentioned often as the leading Ukrainian seaport on the Black Sea. All this is triggering a global food crisis. The world is bracing itself for hard times ahead. Thank you. Thank you very much for giving your insights of the Davos takeaways. This was Oleksii Honcharenko, a member of Ukrainian Parliament. Our next briefing is coming up at 12. We'll talk to Oleksandr Starukh, the military governor of Zaporizhzhia region. We'll discuss the situation in the region. We'll talk about the local economy and the war. This is the 92nd day of the Ukrainian resistance and operation of the Media Center Ukraine. We continue our next briefing. We shall talk to Oleksandr Starukh, the head of Zaporizhzhia military administration. Greetings. Greetings. The first question is one of a philosophical kind. Zaporizhzhia region is divided in two by the front line, by the line of contact, and you have to deal with the issues of war and also sustain the peaceful economy. How do you manage? The region has been at war for 92 days without a day exception, and we have three stories. We have the story of the occupied territories maintaining life there, giving support to the people. The other situation is the area of operations, the area of hostilities. It is most complicated as it entails all the challenges for settlements like Polohe, who have been exposed to heavy artillery shelling starting March, sustaining large-scale destruction. And the third story is the occupied territories, where we have to help the people delivering the essential services there. And also, Zaporizhzhia city has become a refuge for the internally displaced people. Many people from Mariupol, residents of Zaporizhzhia region, have traveled or stayed on in Zaporizhzhia, and we needed to provide humanitarian relief to them. So owing to the dedication of all the people, the unity, the government interventions, the volunteers, and our military, first and foremost, holding the defenses in the region, we keep living and performing the mission to defend our homeland and sustain the life of people on the government-controlled and non-controlled territories. Tell us what is happening on the occupied territories in Enerhodar, Melitopol. uh, there is talk that the Russians intend to hand out Russian passports there. They would try to fabricate some local administration. What are Russians seeking to attain? It's not something we sense, but something we know, as some local government officials are in touch with all the services on the ground in the occupied territories, inclusive sustaining the healthcare, the education, the utilities sectors. The situation is becoming aggravated increasingly. There are systemic challenges to do with the invaders trying to gain control uh, through government, trying to gain control of different areas of life. The most recent development was the decision made by Russians to issue Russian passports and have made according statements. And now we make a gallows joke that instead of sending the passports, they sent us the cruise missiles. The situation is dire. In Ederhodar and Melitopol, people are brutalized in order to accept the Russian rule. They're given a choice between collaboration and missile attacks. All Ukrainians in the temporarily occupied territories know the stories, they know the case studies of Donetsk, Luhansk regions, and Crimea that had been seized by the Russian Federation in 2014. And now the people are mobilizing to resist. People have been killed in the earlier controlled territories and are now perishing here. The Russians are trying to hand out their Russian passports in order to mobilize them to their Russian army as the next step. Zaporizhzhia used to be one of the main hubs as a passage center for the IDPs fleeing Donbass, Kherson, Melitopol. What is the situation like currently in terms of humanitarian status? I think the best word to describe Zaporizhzhia is a shelter, a refuge. People couldn't stay here for long, as Zaporizhzhia is quite close to the front line, and that has been the case since March. So people registered here, uh, took some time to recover and made their onwards travel to the western areas of Ukraine or further abroad. Zaporizhzhia remains this passing point. It's mostly happening through Vasilivka vector. People keep traveling to Zaporizhzhia to seek safety. We have 80,000 IDPs. Many of them come from Mariupol. The numbers change on a daily basis. So yesterday we had 904 people arriving in from Zaporizhzhia, from the temporarily occupied territories, including 120 children. 318 have traveled in from the left bank of Zaporizhzhia, and that has been seen for months. And also Vasilivka district and Melitopol and Mariupol, the people coming from those areas. Some people had traveled on to Berdyansk and stayed in the occupied territories. So there are people from there and Mariupol and other places. So yesterday we received at least 900 people. This flow continues as people leave the areas, and that despite the major obstacles when vehicles were blocked on a number of days, being denied passage through Vasilivka, people were used as a live sheet in order to redeploy the Russian troops. But this influx of people isn't drying up, but the volunteers and the local government and all the residents of our city and region have helped the people and will continue offering help. Zaporizhzhia is one of the hearts of our country. So Zaporizhzhia is definitely one of the hearts of the Ukrainian economy. Is the economy operating in Zaporizhzhia these days? Could you hear my question? So I'll repeat my question. So Zaporizhzhia is definitely one of the hearts of the Ukrainian economy. A lot of major industries are located in Zaporizhzhia that have a major impact on the national economy. So tell us about the current status of the Zaporizhzhia economy. We are doing all we can to sustain the operation of our industries, even Zaporizhzhia nuclear power plant, even though it's under occupation, the personnel and the city is are under occupation, but regardless, the nuclear power plant is operating and delivering energy to the grid. The same pertains to other companies that are operating, providing jobs and helping the war efforts. We are seeing some disruption of the supply chain as we are the easternmost region of Ukraine, and now that the ports are blocked, we used to access a lot of trade links through Berdyansk and the southern Ukrainian ports. This was a major outlet for us to receive the raw materials and to supply our produce, but we are seeking to build new supply channels in order to keep the municipal economy running, as it's critically important to maintain this economic front, because if we don't maintain that, it would be difficult for us to rebuild, feed, and keep the uh, local economy running. We are looking at different alternatives to support the small and medium businesses. We're doing all we can under the conditions we find ourselves in. Thank you very much for information. We wish you victories. We talked to Oleksandr Starukh, the head of Zaporizhzhia military administration. The next briefing is coming up at 1. We'll talk to Denis Marchuk, who is the deputy chairman of the Ukrainian Agrarian Council. We'll talk about the agricultural center, the blockage of seaports, and the prospects for
Триває 92-й день.
This is the 92nd day of Ukrainian resistance. We have Media Center Ukraine. We have Denis Marchuk with us, Deputy Chairman of Ukrainian Agrarian Council, and we'll discuss the status of the agricultural sector in Ukraine. Good day. Denis, our first question to you is how would you describe the status of the agricultural Ukrainian sector? The Ukrainian agrarian sector is holding the second front line in Ukraine, as we are fully aware that we shoulder the great responsibility before the armed forces of Ukraine, fighting our frontiers, defying the enemy, and we agrarians need to make sure that Ukrainian people and army have enough food to go around to be able to confront the enemy. To say it's easy today would not be right. The war is inevitably affecting our operation. The sowing campaign has been hampered, but we managed to perform better than expected, even though in the early days we thought the sowing areas would shrink much more significantly, but so far we are in a position to say that we have sown 75% of the arable land. All the regions have completed their spring sowing campaign. Some are completing some final fields, but this is indicative that the agrarians have coped with their mission, and we will have good performance of the spring crops. So in July we'll be reaping already the crops that can be put on the tables in Ukraine, that can be sold in Ukraine, and this is a way to assure our food security. Tell us, how will the agricultural market change in Ukraine? Will the areas shrink? Will the range of food sown be affected? Will the finished food stuffs be different? Will the export driven companies now cater to the domestic markets? What is bound to change? Well, you have rightly pointed out that the situation is bound to change, and for businesses to stay afloat, they need to adapt to the new realities. And the agrarian businesses are seeing that now we cannot export due to the seaports being blocked, and it used to convey the greatest exports through the Black Sea. So now we need to change gears and sell the crops that we produce in Ukraine. Some companies have changed their crop rotation. Some have sown more buckwheat and other crops. Some are now growing vegetables, as Kherson and Zaporizhzhia lands have been occupied, and we won't be able to produce some of the vegetable crops they had earlier delivered. And therefore, now the central and western companies are filling in. This is a war, and yet it is a unique change to redefine ourselves and less produce the raw crops, but work to create added value. And now there'll be uh, lending offers for the producers in order to create added values so that it can stay on in Ukraine, and also that we can export the products with greater added value. So we are now reconsidering. Some other companies are sowing a wider range of crops. We carry over more than 20 million cereal crops, and the silos are full. In a month and a half, we'll be collecting the winter harvest, and we'll need to store it accordingly. So when the winter crops are reaped, we don't want to keep too much sunflower or corn. So some are sowing soya instead, as it doesn't require such storage facilities. And now the agricultural companies are being flexible to accommodate the changing circumstances. How will the food basket change for the Ukrainians? Will we consume less vegetables? Will we have to do without some crops? I wouldn't say that we'll sense some catastrophic shortage of food, as most Ukrainian lands are liberated and free, and the agricultural companies are growing their crops, rearing livestock, milking cows. We have enough dairy to go around, and that will define what Ukrainians have on their tables in their shopping baskets. And I don't think nothing will change catastrophically. If we don't have, let's say, red caviar, as we won't import it into Ukraine, but otherwise, we should have enough food to go around. We should have enough vegetables too. Today, because of the occupation of the south of Ukraine, the companies can't harvest some vegetables there, but this will be taken over by the western, central, and northern regions. And when the open vegetables are produced, they'll be in greater numbers. We will also keep receiving the imports from Turkey. As we have before, we'll be importing vegetables from Poland. And the question is that hopefully people will be solvent and can afford the traditional food portfolio as the war is hitting all of us, and the price on a number of food commodities has gone up because the supply chains have been disrupted, because the fuel has gone up in price. The inflation is spiraling in Ukraine, and if a year ago we could buy the same product at a certain price, we'd have to pay 15-20% more compared to last year's. If you could give a piece of advice on the 3-5 specific steps that need to be made to improve the standing of agriculture in Ukraine, what would the steps be? What would you recommend? Well, the Agrarian Committee and the Ministry of Agriculture have top-class professionals. As the Ukrainian Agrarian Council, we help shape the agrarian policy in Ukraine. And our number one priority these days is to open export, and this is addressed by the Minister of Agriculture and the President of Ukraine. When he reaches out to the world, he urges the world to help us unblock our exports, and that is important because we have enough food for our domestic consumption, but the other countries might suffer, and there's a looming threat of famine in North Africa and Asian countries. So we need to reap our export potential. We need to open our Black Sea ports. And then we need to prepare for the harvest campaign. And for the harvest campaign, all of us will need support coming from the government, from our international partners, so that the companies would have the fuel and lubricants and sufficient supply. We still had our reserves for the spring sowing campaign, but we are running dry on those inputs, and this is what needs the intervention of the government, business, and our international partners. How we do maintain our traditional foreign markets as we cease exporting our produce, and the companies will still need to uh, meet the demands, perhaps looking for less risky options. It's not easy for them to replace the Ukrainian commodities, as we had supplied a lot of grain, a lot of wheat, uh, uh, contributing 20% of world grain exports. If we talk about processed sunflower seed and oil, we comprise 50% of the global supply, and it won't be able to replace Ukraine in a short time perspective. We all need to think hard the way we could bring in more media, political, and international leverage to force Russia to unblock our ports. And if we open our ports, we don't need to think who needs our export. The world will always need Ukrainian agricultural commodities. As we are export-driven company, we grow much more than we consume. That's one point to make. Secondly, now we've seen facilitated terms of cooperation with the EU. It is a colossal market with 500 million people who are wealthy too. And now that the custom duties and quotas have been lifted on agricultural commodities, we need to make ample use of that opportunity to win over the European consumers, to enter the European supermarkets, to offer high quality produce at affordable prices. And that is a wonderful opportunity for us to produce more added value produce to meet that demand. Thank you very much for your answers. We talked to Denis Marchuk, Deputy Chairman of Ukrainian Agrarian Council. We discussed the status of the agricultural sector in Ukraine. We'll continue.